Everyone knows Elon Musk as the man who conquered space, technology, and headlines, but few know about the quiet moment that nearly broke him and rebuilt him in a way no success ever could. What happened that day, in a forgotten town and a silent, empty church, would awaken something he didn't even realize he'd lost. Elon Musk had never been the kind of man who leaned on religion. To him, faith was always something distant, almost foreign, something other people seemed to reach for when they needed comfort. But then, one quiet afternoon, as he was riding through a nearly forgotten little town, something unexpected happened. Out the window, he spotted a small, weathered church. On a sudden impulse, he told the driver to pull over. Without waiting for anyone else, he got out and walked inside by himself. What unfolded after that would change him in ways that all his past victories never could. The town itself was barely more than a dot on the map, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. Elon sat in the back of his black SUV, watching the empty streets blur past, feeling a strange, hollow ache settle somewhere deep inside his chest. For months now, the world had only seen the unstoppable version of him, the builder, the fighter, the man plastered across headlines, battling lawsuits, launching rockets, creating the next big thing. But behind that relentless image, hidden under all the awards and achievements, something vital had slowly been wearing away. He couldn't explain exactly why he ended up here. His official reason for the trip was a visit to a quiet research facility a few hours outside the city. No cameras, no reporters, just a simple tour. When the meeting wrapped up earlier than planned and his driver asked if he wanted to head straight to the airport, Elon had paused. Something inside him, something he couldn't name, urged him to do otherwise. Just drive, he said. And so they did. The road stretched out ahead of them, winding past rows of bare winter trees and the skeletons of old storefronts, boarded up but still standing. Small-town America, clinging on by sheer force of stubborn hope. It was a side of the world he rarely crossed paths with anymore. And then he noticed it, the church. It was a modest stone building, its steeple listing to one side like it was worn out from too many seasons of storms. The little church sat tucked away at the corner of a narrow side street. The parking lot was empty, and an iron gate swung loosely in the breeze. He didn't stop to weigh it out or ask permission. He simply said, "Stop here." The driver hesitated for a beat, his eyes scanning the quiet surroundings, but in the end, he pulled over without a word. Elon stepped out into the brisk afternoon air, pulling his jacket tighter as the cold wind nipped at him. Through his earpiece, he could hear the low hum of concern from his security team, but he tuned it out. When he pushed open the heavy church door, it groaned loudly on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and the deep, echoing silence of forgotten prayers. Soft, dim light slipped through the stained glass windows, casting muted colors across the worn pews and the cracked stone floor. There were no priests standing at the altar, no choirs filling the air with hymns, no bustling congregation packed into the seats. Just the old building, breathing in the silence, carrying the faint scent of candles long since burned out. For a while, Elon simply stood there, unsure why he had even come. He could have turned back, gone running toward the comfort of plans, strategies, and the controlled environments he knew so well. But instead, he took a step forward. The quiet click of his boots echoed against the stone as he made his way down the aisle. Choosing the very last pew, he slid into it awkwardly, resting his elbows on his knees and letting his hands fall loosely together. And then he just sat there. No speeches formed in his mind. No neatly packaged thoughts. Just a raw, almost painful feeling that took him straight back to boyhood, small, invisible, vulnerable. He didn't pray. He wasn't even sure he knew how. Instead, he simply sat, his eyes wide open, staring at the altar bathed in dusty beams of afternoon light. Minutes drifted by, or maybe hours, time slipping away until he lost all sense of it. The outside world faded, leaving only the faint crackle of half-melted candles and the slow, steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. And that's when he noticed her, an elderly woman, tiny and hunched with age, sitting 3 pews ahead. Her head was bowed so low he could hardly see her face. She hadn't flinched when he entered, hadn't looked his way at all. But now, she slowly lifted her head and turned toward him, her eyes locking onto his. The way she looked at him, so steady, so endlessly kind, made something inside him tremble. Without saying a word, she rose. With the slow, careful movements of the very old, she shuffled toward him. Clutched in her weathered hands was a small, battered prayer book, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed from years of use. When she reached him, she paused. Then, with surprising strength for someone so frail, she placed the book gently into his hands. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was thin but carried a certain unshakable certainty. "You were never alone, child," she said. Elon stared at her, unable to find any words. "You just forgot to listen," she added softly. And then, just as quietly as she had come, she turned and made her way back down the aisle, disappearing into the fading light of the afternoon. Elon remained frozen in place, the worn little book feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. After what felt like an eternity, he found the courage to open it. As he did, a single folded piece of paper fluttered out and landed on the pew beside him. With fingers that trembled slightly, he picked it up and unfolded it. Inside, written in a careful, shaky script, were the words, "For the weary ones who forgot their wonder, may they find it again." Elon closed his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let the walls inside him crumble. He let the silence flood in, and somewhere deep inside, deeper than memories, deeper than all his fears, something small, aching, and stubborn finally started to bloom again. It wasn't wonder in rockets. It wasn't faith in algorithms. It was something much older, something he hadn't even realized he was still missing. Hope, wonder, faith. The sun was sinking low behind the hills as Elon Musk finally stepped out of that little stone church, the battered prayer book still clutched tightly in his hand. The cold air wrapped itself around him, sharp and undeniable, dragging him further out of the strange days he'd been in inside the church. Elon stood still on the stone steps for a long time, just gazing out at the silent, empty street. His black SUV waited at the curb, engine humming quietly, the driver standing patiently by the open door. But Elon didn't move toward it. Instead, he lowered himself onto the steps, elbows resting loosely on his knees, the small prayer book balanced lightly between his hands. He didn't rush to open it again. Instead, he slowly turned it over and over, running his thumb along the worn leather cover, tracing the frayed edges without really thinking. The note tucked inside was still there, its message glowing quietly somewhere at the back of his mind. "For the weary ones who forgot their wonder, may they find it again." There was something about the simplicity of those words that cut through all his usual defenses. It wasn't polished for headlines. It wasn't crafted to grab attention. It was something smaller, something real, honest, and quietly devastating. A reminder that somewhere along the way, he had traded his sense of wonder for strategy, that he had let us slip away, exchanging it for relentless momentum. After sitting there for several minutes, he finally stood up and made his way back toward the car. The driver, still waiting by the door, shot him a concerned look, but Elon simply gave a small nod and climbed inside without a word. The warmth inside the SUV felt almost suffocating after the clean, biting cold outside. As the driver pulled away from the curb, Elon leaned his forehead lightly against the cool glass of the window, staring out as the little town blurred past, dim streetlights flickering over empty storefronts and cracked sidewalks. "Airport, sir?" the driver asked after a moment, breaking the quiet. Elon didn't answer right away. He sat there, letting the silence stretch, before finally speaking. "No," he said softly. "Not yet." Then he gave the driver an address, one he hadn't said out loud in decades. The driver hesitated, clearly surprised, but nodded and turned the car down a narrow side road that led deeper into town. This neighborhood was even quieter than the one they'd just left. Modest houses lined the crumbling sidewalks, their paint peeling, their porches sagging under the slow weight of passing years. There were no skyscrapers here, no glass towers pointing toward the future, only the quiet, stubborn persistence of lives lived out of the spotlight. Eventually, they pulled up in front of a small, weather-beaten house surrounded by a rusting iron fence and a leaning old mailbox. Without waiting for the driver to open the door, Elon stepped out into the crisp evening air, the prayer book still cradled tightly in his hand. He walked slowly up the short path, his boots crunching softly over the dry, scattered leaves. When he reached the front gate, he rested one hand lightly on it, feeling the rough coldness of the metal. For a moment, he closed his eyes. This house had belonged to his great-aunt, a woman who, once upon a time, had filled his childhood with stories that sparked wonder. She had been the first to talk to him about the stars, about the vastness of the universe, about dreams that reached farther than the eye could see. She had been the first person who made him believe that what seemed impossible could become real, if only you dared to reach for it. But somewhere along the road he had traveled, he had forgotten that. Or maybe he had simply buried it, deep under layers of necessity, ambition, and survival. Standing there now, with the evening wind brushing past, he let the memories flood back in. The scent of baking bread from the tiny kitchen drifted back to him. He remembered the scratchy old quilt they used to spread out in the backyard for late-night stargazing. He could still feel her hand on his shoulder, steady and warm, as she pointed up at the sky and said, "Remember, Elon?" Everything magnificent once began as something invisible. Slowly, almost reverently, he opened the prayer book again, treating it like something sacred. The thin, handwritten note was still tucked inside, delicate and soft between his fingers. He read it again, but this time, he let the words really sink into him. For the weary ones who forgot their wonder, may they find it again. A lump swelled in his throat, and this time, he didn't try to swallow it down. Alone beneath the wide, cold sky, he spoke words he hadn't said in what felt like a lifetime. They weren't calculations or commands. They weren't slogans crafted for others to hear. They were something much simpler. Thank you. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Thank you for second chances. Thank you for the stubborn kindness of strangers. Thank you for the tiny miracles tucked away in forgotten towns and battered prayer books. Above him, the stars shimmered faintly through the thin veil of city haze, ancient and infinitely patient. For a long while, Elon simply stood there, breathing, remembering, and listening to the quiet conversation that had always been happening between the earth and the sky. And for the first time in so many years, he felt small, not the kind of small that crushes, but the kind that frees. He realized he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his own. He never really had been. Eventually, the cold began to seep into his bones, and the driver's voice called gently from the car. Elon turned, still holding the prayer book close against his chest, and walked slowly back down the cracked stone path. Without a word, he climbed back into the SUV. As they pulled away from the curb, he took one last lingering glance at the little house disappearing into the night. He didn't know exactly where the road would lead from here, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid. He would follow it, wherever wonder decided to call him. Later, as the jet hummed steadily beneath him, Elon stared out the window at the endless ocean of clouds, their rippling shapes glowing softly under the silver wash of moonlight. The prayer book rested quietly in his lap, unopened since he had left the town behind. Around him, the cabin was silent, his aides either dozing off or lost in their screens, the flight crew moving softly to avoid waking anyone. He should have been working, drafting memos, preparing for meetings, checking endless projections. But none of it felt urgent anymore. The fierce urgency that once pushed him to outpace every competitor, to launch faster, to build higher, to conquer the next summit, it felt muted now. In its place, something else was growing. Something deeper. Something quieter. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, letting the steady rhythm of the engines wash over him, pulling him into a rare and honest moment of reflection. Images floated to the surface of his mind, the quiet, empty church, the elderly woman's unwavering gaze, the weight of the battered prayer book resting in his hands. And above all of it, the unmistakable feeling that something, or maybe someone, had been waiting for him to notice. What stirred inside him now wasn't ambition. It was something deeper. It was longing. When the jet touched down at a private terminal just outside New York City, the first hints of dawn were beginning to stretch across the horizon. Manhattan's towering skyline stood dark and sharp in the distance, silhouetted against the soft, growing light. His security team was ready, his motorcade lined up, but Elon held up a hand, waving them off for a moment. He stood alone at the edge of the tarmac, the cold morning wind tugging at his coat, staring out toward the horizon. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he simply let himself be still. No one was calling his name. No one was demanding his next decision. Behind him, the city buzzed with its usual restless energy, but Elon stayed where he was, listening for the quiet beneath the noise. At last, he climbed into the waiting car. As they sped through the waking city streets, his mind didn't wander to boardrooms or upcoming product launches. Instead, it drifted back to older, softer memories, his mother's whispered prayers by his childhood bed, his great-aunt's star-strewn stories on warm summer nights, and the haunting question that had once kept him awake as a boy. Is there something more? By the time he reached his penthouse, the sky had fully brightened, flooding the grand marble and gold interiors with a soft, unforgiving light. He wandered through the vast, silent rooms without purpose, the prayer book still cradled loosely in his hand. All around him, the trophies, the awards, the priceless works of art, they seemed strangely hollow now, like relics from someone else's life. He placed the prayer book down on the massive oak desk in his study and stood there, staring out at the sprawling city beyond the glass. Without thinking, he dropped to one knee. It wasn't a graceful movement. His body protested, and so did his pride. But he stayed there anyway, feeling the unfamiliar strain in his joints, feeling the sharp vulnerability of the posture. He closed his eyes. "Show me," he whispered. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a plea, raw, stripped of all pretense. Show me how to find the wonder again. Show me how to lead without losing myself. Show me how to build something that matters, not to the world, but to something far greater, something that lasts beyond time. The room around him remained silent. No thunder rumbled. No voice spoke from the heavens. But deep inside, A small, unwavering certainty began to grow. The real work, the real mission, was only just beginning. He stayed there, kneeling, until the ache in his knee became too much to bear. Then he rose slowly, carefully, holding that fragile, precious moment inside him like a tiny ember he couldn't afford to lose. He knew the world would try to strip it away, the demands, the noise, the endless pull of ambition. But he wouldn't forget this. He couldn't. In the days that followed, the outside world only noticed the surface changes. Meetings became shorter, less ruthless. Speeches carried more notes of gratitude than boasts of triumph. Employees started receiving handwritten notes, simple, heartfelt thanks. Old friends got quiet, unexpected calls. His children found him more present, more willing to linger over the small sacred things, a drawing, a joke, a simple moment of shared silence. Speculation ran wild. Some whispered that he was gearing up for a political campaign. Others guessed at a secret illness. No one could quite explain the change, but everyone could feel it. He spent more time alone now, walking the streets without an entourage, browsing forgotten corners of libraries, sitting quietly in tiny coffee shops, slipping into the back pews of Sunday services in old chapels where no one recognized him. He wasn't chasing headlines anymore. He wasn't chasing power. He was searching for something far harder to find, the thread of wonder he had once let slip through his fingers. And slowly, patiently, in the quiet spaces between doing and striving and conquering, he started to find it again. Not through grand revelations or public miracles, but in the smallest of moments, a child's laughter, a stranger's unexpected kindness, the heavy comfort of a battered prayer book tucked into the pocket of his coat, carried everywhere now like a quiet compass pointing him home. The world still roared around him, as urgent and insatiable as ever. But inside, something stronger, something steady had begun to take root. It wasn't a monument he was building anymore. It was a garden, and every day, sometimes with hands that trembled, sometimes with a surprising sense of calm, he made the choice to tend it. Weeks slipped by. Life, as it always did, surged forward, new deals signed, new projects launched, new headlines splashed across screens. But through it all, Elon stayed connected to something no one else could see, a small, stubborn quietness that refused to be drowned out by the noise. One evening, after a long string of meetings that somehow left him feeling more hollow than accomplished, he found himself standing alone in the lobby of his building. The gold fixtures gleamed under the weight of chandeliers. The marble floors were polished so perfectly they reflected back a flawless image. It was beautiful, imposing, everything he had once believed he wanted. And yet, standing there, it felt less like home and more like a museum built to honor someone else's forgotten dreams. On impulse, he turned and walked back outside. His driver scrambled to catch up, but Elon waved him off with a quiet, "Just give me a little time." Pulling his coat tighter against the night wind, he slipped into the crowd moving along the busy sidewalk. No entourage, no destination, just the living, breathing city wrapped around him, messy, imperfect, and alive. His feet moved without needing instructions, carrying him away from the shimmering towers, into older neighborhoods where the brick buildings leaned together like old friends whispering secrets. The harsh neon signs faded into the softer glows of corner shops. The endless hum of traffic softened into the occasional bark of a dog or the distant drift of music from a second-story window. And then he saw it. Tucked between a laundromat and a deli stood a tiny church. Nothing grand or gilded like the cathedrals he had visited across Europe, but humble, worn, and unmistakably loved. A crooked sign out front, lit by a tired bulb, simply read, "All are welcome." Without hesitation, Elon walked up and pushed open the door. Inside, the familiar sense of old wood and melted candle wax wrapped around him like a memory. A few scattered figures knelt quietly in the pews, heads bowed in silent prayer or deep thought. Near the altar, a young priest, barely older than his own son, it seemed, was arranging a row of simple white candles. Elon slipped into the last pew, the creak of the old wood loud against the gentle hush of the space. He closed his eyes, not to pray, not yet, just to breathe, to remember. Time slipped away. Minutes, maybe hours. He lost track of both the ticking clock and the tight grip he usually kept on himself. When he finally opened his eyes, the young priest was standing nearby, his expression open, patient, without a hint of expectation. "Would you like to light a candle?" the priest asked softly. Elon hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He rose from the pew and followed the priest to the front of the church, feeling the gentle awareness of those around him. Not judgment, not curiosity, just quiet companionship. The priest extended a slim white taper toward him. Elon accepted it and leaned forward, touching the unlit wick to the small, steady flame already burning nearby. The wick caught easily, the tiny flame blooming to life between his fingers, delicate, warm, real. He carried the candle carefully to the altar and placed it among the others. No grand declarations, no bargain struck, just a small, simple offering laid down with quiet hands. As he stepped back, the young priest spoke again, his voice so soft it barely rose above a whisper. "Is there someone you would like to pray for?" Elon's mind filled instantly. His children, his mother, the elderly woman from the little stone church who had placed the prayer book in his hands with such unwavering certainty. And then, surprising even himself, he thought of someone else, his younger self, the boy who had once believed in miracles without question. "For all of them," Elon said, his voice rough with emotion. The priest smiled gently and nodded. Elon returned to the pew and sat, letting the heavy silence settle over him like a warm, familiar blanket. Around him, the candles flickered, small, stubborn flames pushing back the dark. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Long enough for the last few parishioners to quietly slip out into the night, leaving him alone with the low hum of the city pressing softly against the thick stone walls. Long enough for something deep inside him to shift once again. When he finally rose to leave, he paused at the doorway and glanced back. The candles still burned, small, steady, enough to light a path if he chose to walk it. Stepping out into the cold night air, he pulled his coat tighter around himself. The city stretched out before him, vast and relentless. But somewhere deeper inside, a new certainty had taken root. He wouldn't spend his life chasing after the world anymore. Instead, he would walk alongside it, offering what he could, building what mattered, tending to the small, stubborn flame that had been reignited in a forgotten church, on a quiet street where no headlines would ever find him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Elon Musk felt real peace. Not because he had conquered something, but because he had finally surrendered, not to defeat, but to grace. The days that followed moved at their usual pace, fast, full, but Elon himself had changed. He returned to his routines, but they no longer felt like chains. Meetings were scheduled more thoughtfully. Conversations that used to focus only on profits, deadlines, and innovation now drifted into different territory. Family, meaning, legacy. Those closest to him noticed the difference. They said little, sensing the change, but hesitant to disturb whatever fragile piece of it he was holding on to. On the surface, the world spun as it always did. Markets surged. Rockets launched. Deadlines crept closer. But inside, within him, something had shifted in a way that no one could quite see, but he could feel. Quietly, and without making announcements, Elon began reaching out to people he hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends, mentors he had lost touch with, employees he had once overlooked. He didn't make grand gestures. Instead, he sent small acknowledgments, real letters, written by hand, filled not with polished statements but simple words of gratitude and humility. One morning, as sunlight spilled weakly through the windows, he found himself drawn back to the small prayer book the elderly woman had given him. It sat on his nightstand now, unassuming, patiently waiting. He opened it slowly, flipping through the delicate, time-worn pages. And there, tucked between two thin sheets, he found something he hadn't noticed before, another piece of paper. It was a simple note, written in the same careful, trembling hand as before. The greatest miracles are often the smallest ones. A heart turned, a grudge forgiven, a soul remembering how to wonder. Elon stared at the words for a long time, letting them settle into him. Miracles, not the kind made of fire and spectacle, but of stillness, of silent shifts so deep and so profound that they could change everything, without a single word ever needing to be spoken. Later that same week, he received an unexpected invitation. A small elementary school had asked if he would come speak to their students about science, technology, and dreams. It wasn't a prestigious event. There would be no cameras flashing, no major press coverage waiting outside, just a gymnasium filled with restless kids and tired teachers. Normally, he would have declined, politely but firmly. But this time, he said yes. He arrived early that day, slipping quietly into the back of the gym and watching the children laugh, squirm, and jostle in their seats. Their excitement was raw, untamed, and it was beautiful. When it was his turn to speak, he made his way slowly to the front of the room, the battered prayer book tucked secretly into the inside pocket of his coat. He talked, of course, about rockets and electric cars, about Mars and impossible possibilities. But then, almost without meaning to, he shifted. He started speaking about wonder, about how easy it was to lose it, how necessary it was to fight to keep it alive. He told them that the greatest achievements in the world weren't always the ones splashed across headlines. Sometimes, they were the quiet victories, the ones that changed a single heart. He ended by telling them that the greatest discoveries they would ever make wouldn't happen in laboratories or on distant planets. They would happen inside themselves. When he finished, the gymnasium fell silent, not because they were bored, but because, somehow, they understood. As Elon left the stage, a small girl, no older than 6 or 7, ran up to him, a crayon drawing clutched tightly in her hand. She held it out to him shyly. It was a picture of him, standing beneath a starry sky, a tiny flame burning bright in his hand. Above it, in crooked, careful letters, she had written, "Never stop lighting the way." Elon crouched down to accept the drawing, blinking hard against the sudden sting in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The little girl smiled, gave him a brief, fierce hug, and then ran back to her seat, her ponytail bouncing behind her. And in that moment, Elon understood. The miracle wasn't in the rockets. It wasn't in the gleaming skyscrapers or the cutting-edge technologies he had poured himself into. It was here, in a small hand offering a crayon drawing, in a battered prayer book carried quietly in a jacket pocket, in the stubborn, defiant refusal to let go of wonder. He walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, the drawing cradled carefully in his hands, and for once, he didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel victorious. He felt something far better. He felt profoundly, humbly alive. He knew there would still be battles ahead, setbacks, noise, doubts. The world would never stop trying to pull him back into its urgency. But now he knew something he had forgotten for too long. The light wasn't something he needed to invent. It had been there all along, waiting for him to remember it, waiting for him to carry it, not as a conqueror, but as a servant of wonder. Looking up into the vast, welcoming sky, Elon smiled, a real smile, deep and unguarded, and whispered into the warm spring breeze, "Thank you." And somewhere, far beyond the noise and demands of the world, the stars answered, not with thunder, but with light.